Hey everyone, today on the plastic canvas we're painting Firebug and Penny from Gatefall by Jack Dyer Studios. Hey everyone, Matt here from the Plastic Canvas and welcome to the second episode in this Gatefall painting series, and today we have a 2-for-1. We are painting Firebug and Penny. They are both characters on the post-apocalyptic team in this skirmish game from Jack Dyer Studios. So I'm starting off the post-apocalyptic team with Firebug and Penny because as soon as my wife saw that there was a dog in this game, she absolutely wanted me to paint it as fast as possible. And when I was looking through the different character cards and looking at their abilities, I noticed that one of Firebug's abilities ties in with Penny. If Penny dies, Firebug gets advantages against the one that killed her. So I figured, well, seeing as they kind of go together, I might as well paint them together. So you get a 2-for-1 today. We're painting both Firebug and Penny. So in the first episode in this series, I started off by painting Brog. He's the big hulking meat shield basically for the fantasy themed team. And one thing that I talked about a fair bit in that video was just how different I found it to paint minis on the scale that they are here in Gatefall. These minis are absolutely massive. Brog is about 120 or so mil tall, compared to the size of the minis that I'm used to painting, because normally minis that come in board games, they're 28 or 32 mil scale minis. They're, the typical size that a mini is, whereas these are much, much bigger. And one of the biggest differences that I found was how much I needed to focus on building up textures and the way that materials actually look. So, as an example, when I was painting Brog's boots, I painted part of them to look like really damaged, worn, and tarnished leather. So lots of scratch and scuff marks and things like that. Now, I've painted that effect on smaller minis, and that's pretty easy to do on a smaller mini because at that scale, you're more just indicating really what the material is and what the condition is, as opposed to actually individually painting in each of those scratch and scuff marks. Whereas once we came up to this scale, it's no longer just an indication as to what the material is and the condition that it's in. You actually need to paint it to look like the thing that you want it to look like, because a scratch or a scuff mark is now much, much bigger. You need to actually individually paint them. But what I found when I was painting Brog was that I really, really enjoyed that. What I've always sort of found to be more of the focus when painting normal size minis, just 28 or 32 mil scale minis, is the highlighting and the shading. Really getting a strong contrast between the darkest part of the shadows and the brightest part of the highlights, and getting nice smooth blends from one tone to another. Whereas when I moved up into this scale, I found that the focus really did shift away from the highlighting and shading and building a strong contrast, more into textures and making each individual little detail really look the way that you want it to. So really playing with the different tones and getting lots of variation within each individual element and actually building up each individual texture. And I have absolutely loved doing that. And I think the main reason is because I found it a much more looser way of painting than highlighting and shading and building up that really, really strong contrast. Now, when I say looser, I don't for a second mean that it's any easier. It is still very, very difficult to actually replicate textures and the ways that different materials look. But it's just more free, I suppose. There's a lot more experimentation in it, and just trying a tone or a wash or something like that and sort of going, well, that didn't work, and then painting back over it and trying it a different way. Or maybe it works perfectly and then you've just learnt something new. So I just found it really, really enjoyable because there is just that For me, it feels like a bit more freedom in it, whereas when you're highlighting and shading, you're trying to really accurately put each tone in the right spot so that it's accurately representing how the light would be hitting that material, and so that just doesn't feel quite as free to me as what this does. This just feels like you're able to experiment a lot more and just try some different things. So while it is still very early days for me painting at this scale, because Firebug here is only the second mini that I've painted, I think I've really found here the scale that I most enjoy painting at, just because of how free and experimental you can be with building up all of these different textures. So as we're going through this video, I really hope that you enjoy watching it as much as I enjoyed painting Firebug and Penny. So just as a little catch up so far, I started by laying down a black prime, and I did that because I knew that all of the colours that I'd be putting over the top, I wanted to keep them as dark as possible. I didn't want any of these colours to be too light or bold, because the overall look that I'm going for with Firebug is that real post-apocalyptic feel where she's wearing these clothes 24/7, they can't be washed, there is no shop to go and buy brand new ones, so they're dirty, they're grimy, they're damaged, they're just wearing whatever they can find to put on their back. So I don't want any of these colours to be too bright and bold, and so that's why I laid down that black prime. I also did that because I knew that there were some metallic parts that I'd be painting that I was going to try and make look really weathered, and starting that effect with a black prime and just kind of inconsistently painting those surfaces to allow some of that black prime to show through is a great way to add to that overall weathered look. And then I just started off with her skin. I started with tan skin, that's just one of my mid-range skin tones, threw a wash over the top of that, and then just highlighted with gradually lighter and lighter tones. Then with her boots, I just built up a really simple leather look, so I just started with ruddy leather, which is one of my browns that has a little bit of red to it, I suppose. Brown wash over the top, and then just started to highlight back up with the ruddy leather, and then just gradually mixed in more and more leather brown, which just started to lighten it off. And now with her pants here, I'm just building up just some green highlights. Now, in the artwork for Firebug, her pants are a really dark green, sort of well on the way to being brown, but I've painted these to be a much brighter green, I suppose, because there's lots of other browns in her clothing, in her boots and her jacket, and then some of the metallics will be a bit rusty, so I just wanted a colour to be in here that just stood out a little bit more and broke up some of those browns, and so I stuck with green for the pants, but rather than keeping them dark and dingy, this is one spot where I did just try and add a little bit more colour, just as a bit of a contrasting element to everything else. Alright, so this part here is a really good example of what I was talking about earlier, where when you move from a smaller scale mini and the focus there is more on building that really strong contrast in the highlight and the shades, to a larger scale mini like this, where the focus becomes more on the textures that you're building up and the finer details. Because with the way that I'm highlighting Firebug Singlet here, it's more of a cross between a stipple and a dry brush, as opposed to trying to just create nice smooth blends from one tone to another. And the reason why I'm highlighting the singlet here in more of this stippling dry brushing technique as opposed to the normal brush motion is because I'm trying to create texture. But also because this highlight is going over the sepia wash that I put down earlier, with that more stippling kind of motion, it highlights inconsistently in that it doesn't cover all of the surface. And the benefit of that in this case is that it inconsistently allows some of that sepia wash that I put down first to show through, which just adds to the overall textured look that I'm going for, but also just that dirty and grimy look that I'm trying to get for Firebug here. And so that's just a good little example of the way that the actual highlighting technique that I use changes from smaller scale minis to larger scale. And so now here I'm starting to work on Firebug's leather jacket, and the overall look that I'm trying to go for here is just to reinforce that post-apocalyptic theme, in that she has been wearing this jacket for a long time, and over time and all of their traveling from one location to another, this jacket has become very faded from all of the sun damage, as well as very scuffed, as they're probably moving in and out of just whatever shelter they can find. So what I'm not trying to create here is a look of battle damage, more just from weathering and their travels. So I started this by laying down ruddy leather, which is my main leather tone that I've got, so it's a brown, but it has a little bit of red mixed into it. And then I threw a brown wash over the top. That's just to mainly flow into the recesses, just so that as I start to highlight in this stippling, dry brushing kind of motion, I can leave all of those recesses nice and dark, just to get a little bit of contrast. And now for the highlighting that I'm doing there in inverted commas, I'm not trying to create the look of light hitting the jacket and there being light and shadow, but more that I'm trying to lighten certain areas to make them appear faded. So I'm still sticking with ruddy leather, but I'm mixing in some leather brown just to lighten it off, and using the same stippling, dry brushing kind of motion that I used on her singlet before, I'm just starting to lighten off certain areas. So with the first layer, I lightened off a fair bit of the jacket, just anywhere that I thought would be copying a fair bit of sun or would be prone to scraping up against surfaces, so the edges of the jacket, folds and things like that. And then once I'd finished that first layer, I then just added in a little bit more leather brown and went around to those same areas, still using this stippling, dry brushing kind of motion, but I just reduced the amount of surface area that I covered. And then just layer by layer, it's gradually getting lighter and lighter, so just more and more of the leather brown is being mixed in. I'm still using that exact same stippling, dry brushing motion, but I'm just further and further reducing the amount of surface area that I'm covering, just to make certain areas look more faded and scuffed than others, just to really reinforce that look that she has had this jacket for a long time, and over that long period of time, all of this aging and fading has occurred. And there, just to vary the tones a little bit, I threw a sepia wash over the whole jacket, just to bring those scuff marks down a little bit, which is going to help boost the contrast as these last couple of layers get lighter and lighter. And you'll notice that for these last couple of layers, still using this stippling dry brushing motion, but you can see that I've moved to one of my smaller brushes just so I can be that bit more precise where these final layers of all of these scuff marks and faded areas really go. But the key here is to make sure that you're reducing the amount of surface area that you're covering with each layer, and that really helps to bring out that look that all of this fading and these scuff marks have occurred over time, because you have so many different tones going on. You can see like the undersides of the sleeves, they have next to no fading at all because that's been in shadow all the time. Or, you know, parts that are not going to be scuffed up against surfaces, like if you're squeezing through corridors and things like that. The edges and the outer facing surfaces are going to brush up against them and scuff over time, whereas the parts of the jacket that are more protected aren't going to. So if you really vary those tones, that's how you can really reinforce that look, that all of this scuffing and fading has occurred over time, and that just really, really reinforces that post-apocalyptic look. Alright, so here with this shoulder bit of armor, this is a spot where I veered quite a bit away from what's actually in the artwork, because here I wanted to really kind of lean into that post-apocalyptic look that we often see from like movies and things like that, where there's a lot of customization into the appearance of how weapons and armor and things like that look. So what I wanted to try and give the appearance of here is that Firebug has just kind of, thrown some scrap together to make this shoulder bit of armor, but then has painted it up herself. But then over time, these yellow paint marks that are on there have become chipped, faded, maybe there's a little bit of battle damage. So I base coated it with a mix of black and my gunmetal, just to keep the steel color nice and dark, threw those yellow lines over the top, and now I've gone back to that same black and gunmetal mix, and with an older brush where I could flare the bristles out a little bit, I just kind of stippled around the edges just to inconsistently make it look as though these yellow lines have been chipped, and then right at the end there, just with one of my smaller brushes with a bit of a finer point, I just more carefully did some scratch mark looking things, just to give the impression that these were clean, straight yellow lines at one point, but now over time they've just been inconsistently chipped away. So that's just a really, really quick and easy way to make any painted surface look as though it has become chipped or damaged, and you could do it with just about anything. You could do it with paint markings on guns or on planes or anything like that. You just lay your base coat color down first, then pick a different color to be the actual painted, like the hand painted parts on the gun or whatever it is, and then just go back to the base coat color and then just stipple over the surface that you want to look as though has been hand painted, and by laying that base coat color back over the top, it now makes it look as though that's actually showing through in those spots where those painted surfaces have become chipped. And yeah, it's very, very quick and simple, but the effect is pretty cool, and I think it worked well here. Alright, so I think at this point it would have to be pretty fair to say that Firebug would be the mini that I've painted where I have done by far and away the most amount of stippling. I feel like just about every single individual part of Firebug has had some amount of stippling done to it. But that is because it is a really quick and easy way to be able to build up that beaten and damaged sort of look. So, like with the way that I base coated the flamethrower here, I mixed together a really dark metallic colour, and then just stippled that on over the top of the black prime. And so what that does is it inconsistently puts the paint down, so it allows some of that black to still show through, and then you just don't have that smooth base coat colour. And then with the black wash going over the top and then darkening everything down and kind of hiding a little bit that initial layer, you can then just continue to stipple then over the top of that by gradually mixing in more and more of just the straight metallic color, and then you start to get the impression that the paint's chipped inconsistently, there's scratch marks and things like that, which then just really adds to that overall textured and beaten sort of look. But then, like I did earlier, you can also use that same stippling motion to create a worn leather look because it gives a really good impression of texture. And then you can also play around by using different types of washes over the top and then re-stippling back over the top to boost that contrast and just play around with all of those different tones to really create those different weathered or textured looks or whatever it is that you're going for. But it is a super simple technique to do. The main focus with it though is just on where you're putting each of those individual tones. Alright, so here is where I started to create a muzzle burn effect, and that's just what you often see on the end of flamethrowers and things like that, where the metal has been heated up so many times that it's actually started to discolor it, and it starts to shift towards purples and blues and those sorts of colours. So a little bit earlier, I just base coated the tip of the flamethrower with straight gunmetal, just so that there was a nice clean colour to build this up over. And then the first colour that I went to was my bronze, because if you look at images of actual muzzle burn, the first tonal shift is from silver, or a straight metallic, into that bronze colour. So with it fairly well thinned down, I started with the bronze at the tip of the flamethrower, and then just painted it down maybe 3/4 of the length of this tip, and then just feathered the edge out so that it gradually blended from the bronze back through to that straight silver metallic. Then I repeated that with purple, had it fairly well thinned down, started it at the tip, worked towards the base, but just didn't go as far as I did with the bronze, and again just feathered that edge out so that it blended from the purple into the bronze. Then repeated that with the blue, but again just didn't paint as far down the tip as what I did with the purple, feathered it out, and then just finished with some black right on the end of the tip, just to give that real sort of burnt or singed kind of look. But I think really the key to doing this muzzle burn look is to just pick the most blue that you've got and the most purple that you've got, just so that those colours really stand out in that fairly small amount of area that you've got to do it. And now just to finish off Firebug, I'm just creating a really simple sort of post-apocalyptic wasteland barren looking base. So I just grabbed my gap filler, which is what I always use just to build up some mass for the base, just so that it looks like her feet are kind of sinking into a little bit and that she's actually part of the environment rather than just having been plonked on top. And then with this cork block, I'm just going to break off some smaller bits that'll act as rocks and just press them into the gap filler so that as the gap filler dries, it will just lock them in place. And then once all of that's dry, I'll then base coat the gap filler with a mix of brown and orange, just for that real kind of Mad Maxy post-apocalyptic sort of look. Just to give that really sort of general impression that there's probably been some sort of nuclear war and that the ground has now become scorched. And now that that base coat brown and orange colouring has been done, I'm just throwing a brown wash over the top. This is mainly just to flow into all of those recesses, just to bring out the detail in the base, so that then when this is dry, I can then come back with that same brown-orange mix that I did for the base coat and just dry brush over the top, just to bring that texture out a little bit more. But also by dry brushing, it will give a bit of a dusty, dry kind of effect as well, which will just help to reinforce that look that I mentioned earlier, that there's been a nuclear war and that the ground has just been scorched. And now for the rocks, I'm just base coating with brown, and then I'll be dry brushing over the top to bring out the texture by gradually mixing in more and more grey into that dry brushing colour. And the reason why I'm base coating with brown is because I want these rocks to just look that little bit different to how they do in our world, in this non-post-apocalyptic world. Just so that it looks as though they have been affected by the nuclear fallout. So as I dry brush over the top, yeah, more and more grey is being mixed in, so they will look like rocks, but there will be that brown sort of undertone to them as though they have been affected by whatever it actually was that has caused this post-apocalyptic world. And then just to finish it off, I'm going to stick down just one or two little tufts of grass. And I chose the tufts of grass from my collection that look kind of the most dead, I suppose. So yes, they're green, but there is quite a bit of brown in them as well. So there is still some vegetation, but for the most part, it's just been wiped out. And hopefully with this combination of that brown and orange dirt base coat color, those rocks there, and just these little tufts of grass just here and there, it gives the impression that this probably was once a fertile land, but through the nuclear fallout or whatever it was, it's just been decimated. And then just to clean it up, just painting a black edge. And that is Firebug finished. I had an absolute ton of fun painting Firebug. Like I mentioned earlier, the same thing with Brog. These minis that are on this much larger scale are just heaps of fun to work on because there's so many different textures that you can build up. There's that worn and aged leather in her jacket, so what I was trying to create there was the impression that she's had this jacket for a really long time. It's become faded from the sun, but then also becomes scuffed potentially from all of the small shelters that they've had to move in and out of. Then there was that chipped yellow paint on her shoulder armor, and then also that muzzle burn. Just all of these different elements that you're creating are just lots and lots of fun to paint, and then when they all combine to finish off that mini, they just look really cool, and that's just what I'm really enjoying painting at the moment. So now that Firebug is done, we're moving into Penny, which is the dog companion on the post-apocalyptic team. But I'm not really going to talk it all through this part because I kept Penny pretty simple. Just the overall look that I wanted to go for was that she is, for the most part, largely unscathed because she's pretty quick at dashing through anything that's going on, but that she is just a bit dirty because she has been in this post-apocalyptic world for quite a while. So I hope you enjoyed the rest of the video, and then I'll just come back in at the end. Alright, so with just the last couple of little bits to go, that finishes off both Penny and Firebug. So thank you very, very much for checking out another one of my videos. As always, I hope you enjoyed it and found something useful that you can take away and use in your own painting. I absolutely loved painting both of these. Like I mentioned earlier, just being able to build up all of those different textures, that's just what I'm really, really enjoying about painting at the moment. So I'm looking forward to getting into the rest of Gatefall. If you did enjoy this video and you found something useful, please do consider giving the video a thumbs up and hitting that subscribe button if you haven't yet, and check out the Facebook, Twitter and Instagram accounts for this channel where you can see what I'm painting at the moment and so what videos are going to be coming out in the future. But that's going to do us for today, so until next time, this is Matt from the Plastic Canvas signing out. Happy painting everyone, cheers.